I didn't slam a door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't send a single angry text. I just sat there at that table, surrounded by people holding champagne flutes and laughing too loudly. And I let her words settle into me, the way cold water settles into dry ground quietly, completely, with nowhere left to go. That was 6 months ago. I'm 62 years old. And it took me until that evening to finally understand something I should have understood years earlier. That silence can be the loudest thing in a room if you know how to use it. Let me start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I met my wife Sandra 11 years ago at a work conference in Phoenix. She was presenting on supply chain logistics. I was in the back row with bad coffee and worse posture, and somewhere between her second slide and her third, I stopped taking notes entirely. She was sharp, funny in that dry way that sneaks up on you, and completely uninterested in impressing anyone. I found that more attractive than anything else. We dated for 2 years. She was honest with me early on. She had a daughter from her first marriage, a girl named Kayla who was 17 at the time and living with Sandra full-time. Her ex-husband, from what I gathered in pieces over months, had been largely absent. Not cruel, just absent. The kind of man who shows up for the good parts and disappears when things require something from him. I didn't have children of my own. I'd been married once before, briefly, in my late 30s. No kids. When Sandra and I got serious, I told myself I was walking into this with open eyes. I think I was wrong about that. We got married when Kayla was 19. By then, she'd grown comfortable with me in the way that teenagers grow comfortable with furniture, acknowledging it exists, occasionally using it, never particularly grateful for it. I told myself that was normal. I told myself she was still young, still adjusting, still carrying whatever weight her father had left behind. Sandra worked hard. She traveled for work 3 weeks out of every month during those early years, and I worked from home as a retired civil engineer doing part-time consulting. That meant I was the one home most evenings. I was the one who made dinner. I was the one who drove Kayla to appointments when Sandra was in Chicago or Dallas or Seattle. I was the one who helped her with her college applications because Sandra was on a red eye and couldn't get to her laptop. Kayla got into a good school, a really good school, actually a university in the Northeast with a strong business program. We celebrated, Sandra cried. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving. Then the tuition bill arrived. Kayla's father contributed nothing. Sandra covered part of it, but her salary, while good, wasn't structured for that kind of recurring expense without strain. I offered to help. Sandra said she didn't want me to feel obligated. I told her she wasn't obligating me, I was choosing it, and I meant that. Over 4 years, I paid roughly 60% of Kayla's tuition and living expenses. Not because anyone asked me to, because she was my wife's daughter, and I wanted her to have a real start. I wanted to be useful. I wanted, if I'm honest, to matter to this family I'd married into. Kayla graduated on a Saturday in May, 8 months ago. Sandra organized a dinner afterward at a nice restaurant downtown, 12 people, 2 long tables pushed together. Her parents, Sandra's sister and her husband, a few of Kayla's close friends, Kayla's boyfriend at the time. I wore a tie, which I almost never do. I'd bought Kayla a card and put a check inside a generous one, the kind that takes a breath to write. We were maybe 40 minutes into dinner when it happened. Sandra's father made a toast. He was talking about family, about roots, about how proud everyone was. He raised his glass toward the table generally, and then he said something like, "And we're especially grateful for the people who stepped up when it mattered." He was looking at me when he said it. Kayla was sitting 3 seats to my left. I saw her face shift. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only catch if you've been watching someone for years and you know what their neutral looks like. Her jaw tightened slightly. She looked down at her plate. Then Sandra's sister said warmly, "Marcus has really been there for this family." And Kayla said, not quietly, not under her breath, but in that clear, caring voice she'd inherited from her mother. I mean, it's not like he's actually family. The table went quiet in that specific way where everyone hears everything and everyone pretends they didn't. She didn't look at me when she said it. She was reaching for her water glass. She took a sip. She set it down. I didn't respond. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of chicken. I put it in my mouth and chewed slowly and looked at the candle in the center of the table. Sandra looked at me. I could feel it. I didn't look back. Her sister said something to change the subject. The conversation started again, lumpy and careful, the way conversations do after something breaks the surface. People laughed a little too quickly at the next joke someone made. Kayla's boyfriend put his hand on her arm. I sat through the rest of the dinner. I was polite. I said goodbye to Sandra's parents. I shook hands. I drove home without saying much. That night, lying in the dark with Sandra beside me, she said, "I'm sorry about what she said." I said, "I know." She said, "She didn't mean it the way it sounded." I said, "I think she meant it exactly the way it sounded." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's young. She's had a complicated relationship with—" "I know all that," I said. "I've known all that for 11 years. We didn't argue. We just lay there in the dark, and eventually, Sandra's breathing slowed and she was asleep, and I stayed awake for a long time thinking about something my father told me once. When I was maybe 25 and complaining about a situation at work where I felt invisible, he said, "Son, people will treat you exactly as well as you teach them to treat you, not better." I hadn't thought about that in years. Over the following weeks, I turned the evening over in my mind the way you turn a stone over and over in your pocket without really meaning to. I wasn't angry, exactly. Or rather, I was angry, but underneath the anger was something older and quieter, a kind of recognition, an acknowledgement of something I'd been careful not to look at directly for a long time. I started pulling up statements. Old ones, the tuition payments, semester by semester, the supplemental credit card I'd added Kayla to 2 years ago, which she used for gas and groceries, and I'd noticed fairly regularly for things that were neither. The car insurance I'd been covering since she turned 25 because Sandra asked me to, and I'd said yes without thinking much about it. I added it up. I won't give you the exact number, but it was significant. The kind of number that, when you write it on a piece of paper and look at it, makes you sit back in your chair. Then I tried to remember the last time Kayla had said thank you to me. Not in passing, not the reflexive kind that people say when you hand them something, the kind that means something. I couldn't remember one. I want to be clear about something. This isn't a story about money. I don't want anyone to think I helped this family because I expected gratitude as payment. I helped because I wanted to. I love Sandra. I wanted to be a good husband. I wanted to be, in whatever way I could be, a steady presence in Kayla's life. But there's a difference between giving freely and giving invisibly. There's a difference between asking for nothing and being treated as nothing. She was 28 years old, not a teenager navigating her parents' divorce, not a child who didn't know better. 28. At that age, you know exactly what you're saying and who you're saying it to. I made a few phone calls that week. I spoke to my financial advisor. I spoke to my attorney, a man I'd known for nearly 20 years, who had handled my will and some property matters over the years. He's straightforward and doesn't offer opinions unless you ask for them. I asked for his opinion. He said, "It sounds like you've been more than fair." That was enough for me. On a Tuesday morning, while Sandra was in Houston for a work trip, I sat at my desk and made several decisions. None of them dramatic, none of them cruel. Just adjustments. Corrections to a situation that had drifted further from what I'd intended than I'd allowed myself to see. I called the bank and removed Kayla from the supplemental credit card. I called the insurance company and removed her vehicle from my policy. I made changes to my estate documents, changes that reflected the reality of the relationship rather than the relationship I'd hoped it would become. When I was done, I sat for a moment in the quiet of my office. The house was very still. Outside, a neighbor was mowing their lawn. I listened to it for a while. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, and left an envelope on the table. Inside the envelope was not an angry letter. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a simple, one-page document, a summary of what I'd changed and why, written as calmly as I could write it, without blame, without accusations, without anything I'd regret later. I addressed it to Sandra. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I told her I needed her to understand something before I could continue the way things had been. Then I drove to my brother's house across town and stayed there for 3 days. I want to tell you what those 3 days felt like, because I think it matters. The first evening, I sat on my brother's porch and felt, underneath everything, a kind of relief so deep it surprised me, like I'd put down something heavy that I'd stopped noticing I was carrying. My brother brought me a beer and didn't ask too many questions, which is what you need from a brother in those moments. We watched the sun go down. I ate leftover pasta at his kitchen table and slept better than I had in months. The second day, Sandra called 12 times. I let most of them go to voicemail. I listened to the messages. By the sixth one, she had read the letter. Her voice was different after that, less alarmed, more careful. She said she wanted to talk. She said she understood why I'd done it. She said, "Please call me back." On the third day, I called her. We talked for a long time. She asked me what I needed. I told her honestly. I told her I needed her to stop explaining Kayla's behavior to me as if I were too simple to have already considered those explanations myself. I told her I needed her to stop asking me to absorb things without acknowledging they happen. I told her I needed to know where I actually stood in this family, not where I was theoretically supposed to stand, but where I actually stood. Sandra was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she said, "You stand at the center of it. You always have. I've just been bad at showing you that." I believed her. I still believe her. What I wasn't prepared for was the conversation that came 2 weeks later. Sandra told Kayla what I'd done. I didn't ask her to. She told me afterward that she'd felt it was necessary. Kayla asked to meet with me. Not called me, not texted, asked Sandra to ask me, which told me something about where we were. We met at a coffee shop near their house one afternoon. Kayla was already there when I arrived. She had her hands wrapped around a cup and she looked younger than 28, somehow, sitting there without the confidence she usually carried around like a second outfit. She apologized. I want to be honest with you about how I received that apology. I sat across from her and I listened to it, and I believe she meant it, or at least some of it. But I also noticed things. I noticed that the apology arrived after the credit card was canceled, not before. I noticed that it focused heavily on the stress she'd been feeling and what she'd been going through, which is not the same thing as acknowledging what she'd said and who she'd said it to. I didn't say any of that out loud. I thanked her for coming. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I told her I hoped we could find our way to something better. She said, "I know you've done a lot for me." I said, "I did it because I wanted to." That part was always true. She nodded. She looked at her coffee. Then she said something that I've been thinking about ever since. She said, "I think I was angry at someone else and I took it out on you." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I know. I've known that for years. That's not the part that hurt." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I said, I understood where it was coming from. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that after 11 years, you still thought it was okay to say out loud." She didn't answer that. The coffee shop was loud around us. The way coffee shops are in the afternoon, espresso machines, somebody's music through earphones, a couple at the next table talking about something I couldn't make out. I drove home with the windows down. That was 3 months ago. Things are different now, and I'm still learning what different means. Kayla and I are not close. I don't know if we ever will be, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. What I do know is that she is no longer on my credit card, and that has not changed anything about how often she comes to Sunday dinner. Which is more than I expected and less than Sandra hoped. She's polite to me. I'm polite to her. Whether that grows into something or stays exactly where it is, I'm not driving that, and I'm not pretending to. Sandra and I are good. Better than good, maybe, in the way that marriages sometimes are after the difficult things are finally said. She started saying things out loud that I think she'd been keeping below the surface for a while about feeling caught between us, about the weight of that, about her own complicated feelings toward Kayla's father and how that bled into everything else. I listened. I told her things I'd kept below the surface too. We went to 2 sessions with a counselor, not because we were in crisis, but because we decided we wanted to do it right. What I want to say to anyone who might be listening to this, anyone who's ever sat at a table and absorbed something that should have been said out loud and addressed, is this. You are not selfish for having limits. You are not cold for finally naming them. The most decent thing I did in 11 years was not the tuition payments or the insurance or the driving to appointments at 7 in the morning. The most decent thing I did was stay in the room, quietly, until I had something clear to say, and then I said it. Not with anger, not with a door slam, or a lawyer's letter full of accusations. With an envelope on a kitchen table. And silence, when you've earned it, is not the absence of something. It's the presence of something that finally has enough weight to be felt. I'm 62 years old. I've learned that lesson later than I should have, but I learned it. The envelope is still on my desk. I kept it, not the copy I left her, but the draft I wrote first, before I got the words right. It's in a manila folder in the second drawer on the left. I don't look at it often. I don't need to, but I know it's there. Some mornings I come into the office early, before Sandra's up, and I sit with my coffee in the quiet, and I think about that graduation dinner. I think about that candle in the center of the table. I think about what my father said about teaching people how to treat you. I was a slow learner. I don't think I am anymore.